Iris Pemberton believed her life was measured in shades of gray. The stone floors of the Stone Creek pack house were gray, worn smooth by generations of feet more important than hers. The steam rising from the laundry vats was gray, clouding the air in the kitchens where she spent most of her days. Even her own wolf, the spirit that should have been a vibrant, living thing within her, was a gray and silent emptiness. An Omega with a dormant wolf was less than nothing, a flaw in the fabric of their society. She was a ghost who served stew, a shadow who mended tunics. She was 22 years old and had never been looked at, not really. Her existence was a quiet apology. Her only escape, her only splash of color, came from the basket of discarded books she kept under her cot. The pages were brittle, the stories worn, but she loved them. When the ache of her loneliness became a physical weight in her chest, she would take a page and fold. Her fingers, nimble from years of darning socks and shelling peas, would crease and tuck the fragile paper until it bloomed. A blue delphinium for sorrow, a yellow daffodil for a fleeting moment of warmth from the sun on her face. A pale pink rose for the love she read about in stories, but was certain she would never know. They were her secret garden, a collection of fragile things that, like her, were made from what was left over. Paper flowers were her language when words failed her. Paper flowers were how she spoke to a universe that had never bothered to listen. The announcement from their alpha, a stern but fair man named Alaric, was a stone dropped into the placid pool of her routine. The Bonds Across Borders Initiative, a kingdom-wide program to connect pack members with soldiers stationed on the remote borders, was now mandatory for all unmated adults. It builds morale, Alpha Alaric had boomed, his voice filling the dining hall. It strengthens the kingdom. It reminds our warriors what they are fighting for. Iris had trembled. The thought of writing to a stranger, a strong alpha or beta soldier, was terrifying. What could a wolfless Omega possibly say to a warrior? What part of her gray life could possibly be of interest to him? But an alpha's directive was not a suggestion. She filled out the small application card, her hand shaking so badly that her name, Iris Pemberton, was a spidery scrawl. Under the section for interests, she simply wrote, "Reading." It seemed safer than writing folding paper flowers from heartbreak. She sealed the card and dropped it into the collection box, feeling as if she'd just mailed a piece of her own insignificance out into the world. She expected nothing. It was safer that way. To hope was to invite disappointment, and her life already had a surplus of that. Weeks passed and she forgot about it, sinking back into the familiar rhythm of her work. Then, one evening, the pack's beta sought her out, a look of mild confusion on his face. He handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the royal seal of the capital. Her breath caught. Inside was not a pre-printed assignment, but a letter, the parchment heavy and expensive. Her match was simply designated as Wolf 123 from the royal pack. A strange, unfamiliar warmth fluttered in her chest. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was just a flicker. A single point of light in the endless gray. She retreated to her small room, her fingers tracing the elegant script. It was a man's handwriting, strong and bold. Yet there was a slight hesitation in the loops, a tightness in the spacing, as if the writer was unaccustomed to the act of sharing. She opened it, and the world shifted on its axis. King Stellan Thorn, the alpha of alphas, ruler of all the packs in the kingdom, sat in a room of cold gray stone and watched the sun bleed across the horizon. From his private study at the highest point of the castle, he had a view of the entire world, yet he had never felt more trapped. The stone walls were his prison, the crown on his head a shackle of gilded iron. He was surrounded day and night by his royal guard, his council of elders, his beta commanders, and an endless parade of ambitious nobles pushing their daughters toward the throne. He was the most powerful wolf on the continent, and he was suffocating. His wolf, a creature of immense power and primal instinct, paced restlessly within him, yearning for the feel of earth under its paws, for a true connection that had nothing to do with treaties or bloodlines. It was a raw, aching loneliness that no amount of power could fill. Every word he spoke was weighed, every glance analyzed. He was a symbol, a crown, an alpha king. He had forgotten what it felt like to simply be Stellan. The Bonds Across Borders program had been his idea, a way to connect the disparate parts of his kingdom. But when he'd reviewed the final proposal, a reckless, desperate impulse had seized him. On a whim that felt more honest than anything he had done in years, he had his most trusted aides submit an anonymous application under the simple, unidentifiable moniker, Wolf 123. He wanted, just for a moment, to be a soldier on a wall, a wolf without a name, reaching out for a human connection without the crushing weight of his crown. He never expected to be so nervous. When the first letter arrived from his match, an Omega named Iris Pemberton from the provincial Stone Creek pack, his hands that could command armies and fell challengers, trembled slightly. The paper was simple, thin, but it smelled faintly of lavender soap and old books. Her letter was short, polite, and filled with a quiet humility that felt like a cool drink of water in the desert of his court. She wrote about the weather, the changing leaves, the satisfactory feeling of a well-darned sock. There was no flattery, no agenda, no expectation. It was just real. His wolf, the great tempestuous beast inside him, grew quiet. It settled, its head on its paws, listening. Stellan found himself staring at the blank page for an hour, the royal quill heavy in his hand. What could he say? He couldn't write about negotiating trade agreements with the southern packs or the headache of his meddling council. He looked out his window at the fiery sunset. He thought about how he watched it every night, alone, and how no one ever seemed to notice its beauty. They only noticed his presence. So he wrote that. He wrote about the colors of the sunset from a cold stone room. He described the exact way the light turned the clouds a shade of amber just before the sun touched the horizon, how it burned for exactly 3 minutes before fading to pink, then purple, then darkness. He wrote about the strange feeling of being surrounded by people but feeling utterly invisible. He described the echo of his own footsteps in empty halls, how the stone magnified every step into an accusation. He wrote about watching the sunset and how it was the only time the burden of his crown felt slightly lighter. It was awkward, painfully shy, the truest thing he had written in a decade. He signed it simply, Wolf 123. He sealed the letter, his heart pounding with a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. He had sent a piece of his soul to a stranger, a quiet Omega in a distant pack. He had no idea he had just posted the first piece of his salvation. He had no idea that her reply, when it came, would contain not just words, but a small, folded piece of paper that would feel more valuable than any jewel in his treasury. The letters became their lifeline, a secret world built of parchment and ink. For Iris, his replies were the sun breaking through a perpetual cloud cover. This soldier, this Wolf 123, understood her. He never pitied her for her dormant wolf or her Omega status. He seemed to see past it, to the person underneath. He wrote of feeling like a fraud, of the immense pressure to be strong and unyielding when all he felt was weary. He never spoke of battles or glory, only of the quiet moments in between. The taste of the first winter snow on the air, the sound of a distant howl on the wind. He saw the world with the soul of a poet, and his words painted pictures in her mind of a man who was gentle and kind, burdened by a duty he carried with quiet grace. She found herself living for the mail courier's arrival. The letters came to define the rhythm of her life. 2 weeks after his first letter, she received his second, in which he described watching snow fall from his window. He wrote in detail about how the flakes seemed to pause mid-air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He confessed that he wondered if she was watching the same snow, seeing the same sky, and whether the snow felt cold against her skin as it did against his. He wrote, "Sometimes I press my palm against the glass and pretend someone is on the other side, pressing back. Is that foolish? Her response came filled with her own confession. She told him about standing at her window in the pack house, watching that same snow. And yes, she had pressed her hand against the cold glass and thought of a stranger she didn't know. She had wondered if he was thinking of her. She included a small sprig of white paper snowflakes, painstakingly folded from tissue-thin pages. Later, when he wrote to her about a storm that brought thunder that shook his tower room at night, she learned something precious. The great Alpha King was afraid of thunder. It was a vulnerability that undid her completely. He confessed that the sound sent his wolf into a frantic state, that loud noises made the beast panic, and he didn't understand why. In her next letter, she sent him a paper lavender sprig. "For courage during storms," she wrote. "For the fear that is not weakness, but simply the tender part of us that feels deeply." When he wrote back that he had placed the lavender on his nightstand and slept better than he had in years, she realized she was falling in love with something deeper than his words. She was in love with his capacity to trust her with his fragility. The letters evolved over the months. The early ones were formal and careful, two strangers testing the waters. By the third month, they had shed some of their caution. The fifth month brought letters that made her blush. He wrote about the way he imagined her face might look in candlelight, about wondering what her laugh sounded like. The eighth month brought letters so intimate she had to read them alone in the dark, her heart racing. He wrote about missing her, about the strange ache of loving someone he had never touched. He told her he kept her first letter under his pillow. She found herself living for the mail courier's arrival. She began to pour her own heart onto the pages. She told him about her paper flowers, how she folded her feelings into them when they became too big to hold. Hesitantly, she tucked one into her next letter. It was a small blue iris, folded from the page of a book describing the sea. "For the sadness you feel," she wrote, "so you know you are not alone in it." She waited for his reply with breathless anxiety, certain she had overstepped, that a hardened soldier would find her gesture foolish. His next letter arrived faster than usual. "I have it on the windowsill of my room," he wrote. "It is the first thing I see when I wake. No one has ever given me a flower before. Thank you, Iris." After that, every letter she sent contained a flower, a vibrant red poppy for courage before a training inspection he mentioned, a sunny yellow daffodil for the hope his letters gave her, a gentle lavender sprig for the peace she wished for him, a soft white lily for the purity of what they were building. She pictured him lining them up on a rough wooden sill in a sparse barracks room, and the image made her heart ache with a fierce, protective tenderness. She was falling in love with a man she had never met, a man whose face she couldn't picture, but whose soul she knew intimately. For Stellan, her letters were an addiction. He lived for them. He would dismiss his counsel, lock the door to his study, and tear open the envelopes with an eagerness that felt boyish and utterly foreign. The scent of her, lavender and old paper, would fill his senses, and his wolf would purr, a low, rumbling sound of pure contentment. "Mate," the wolf would whisper, a word that was both a shock and a deep, soul-shaking certainty. "Our mate writes to us." He knew it was true. The moon goddess worked in mysterious ways, and she had given him his mate not in a grand ballroom or on a battlefield, but through the quiet intimacy of shared words. There was one letter in particular that he read so many times the creases had become soft as fabric. In it, she described a day when winter had come early to Stone Creek. Snow had fallen unexpectedly, and she had stepped outside to feel it on her face. She wrote about the cold that made her skin sting, and the peculiar beauty of watching the world transform under a blanket of white. She confessed that she had thought of him as she stood in the snow, wondering if he too had stepped outside to feel winter's bite. In his response, he had described his own routine of opening his tower window in the deepest part of winter, letting the cold snap him awake, letting the raw air of the season remind him that he was still alive beneath all the gold and ceremony. He had written that reading her letter made him realize he was no longer alone in these small rituals. Somewhere, she was also feeling the cold. Somewhere, she was also reaching for connection with the natural world. It was a simple exchange, but it had changed everything. The realization that they could exist in the same moment, separated by distance but not by experience, had crystallized his certainty. This was his mate. He cherished her paper flowers as if they were the crown jewels. He cleared a shelf in his locked safe, the one meant for state secrets and treaties, and placed each one there carefully. The blue iris sat beside the red poppy, a garden of impossible fragility blooming in the darkness. He kept everything, every letter, every envelope, every stray petal of paper. They were relics of the only real connection he had, tangible proof that somewhere, someone was thinking of him, not as a king, but as a man worth loving. He found himself changing. He smiled more. He listened to the petitioners with more patience. He saw the world through her eyes, noticing the small kindnesses, the beauty in the mundane. His beta, a lifelong friend named Lucian, watched him with a wary eye. "You seem different, my king," Lucian said one day, as Stellan stared out the window, a soft smile on his face. "Happier." Stellan had just received a letter where Iris described a litter of wolf pups tumbling in the yard, and he couldn't hide the warmth that spread through him. He simply nodded. "Perhaps I am." He was terrified of telling her the truth. How could he? She was falling for a humble soldier, a man she called "my dear wolf," not an alpha king. The revelation would shatter the pure, honest thing they had built. It would become about his crown, his power. He would lose the one person who saw Stellan, not the king. And so he kept his secret, writing from his stone tower, pretending to be a lonely man on a wall, all the while knowing his deception was a thread that could unravel at any moment. He was a king living a lie, and he was falling deeper in love with every word she wrote. A year to the day after their first letters were exchanged, Iris sat by the light of a single candle, her heart a wild bird in her ribs. A full year of his words had transformed her. She was no longer just the gray Omega. She was Iris, the woman who made a lonely soldier smile. She was the keeper of his secrets, the recipient of his beautiful, aching vulnerability. She was loved. He had never written the words, not explicitly, but she felt it in every line. In the way he described missing her letters if the courier was delayed. In the way he asked about the smallest details of her day. He had given her a voice. And now that voice had something it needed to say. Something so enormous it felt like it might tear her apart if she kept it inside. Her hands trembled as she uncapped the ink pot. She had spent the entire day folding a single intricate flower, a white rose, its petals layered and complex, made from the title page of her favorite book of poetry. It represented everything she felt: purity, devotion, a love that was terrifying in its depth. She wrote the letter with a stream of honesty that left her breathless. "My dearest Wolf," she began. "A year ago, I was a ghost, a person made of silence and duty. I did not know that a heart could feel like this, so full it hurts. I don't know your face or the sound of your voice, but I know your soul, and it is the kindest soul I have ever known. I don't know if this is foolish, or if I am breaking some unspoken rule between us, but I cannot keep it in my heart any longer. I love you." She stared at the words, her confession stark and vulnerable on the page. She tucked the white rose into the envelope, her fingers caressing the fragile paper. It felt like she was sending her own heart through the mail. She sealed it with a drop of wax and gave it to the courier the next morning, her hand shaking. And then the silence began. A day passed, then two. She told herself the couriers were slow, that winter storms were delaying the route from the capital. By the end of the first week, a cold dread had begun to seep into her bones. He had always replied within 3 days. Always. She reread her last letter, her cheeks burning with shame. Had she been too bold? Had she frightened him away with the intensity of her Omega emotions? Perhaps he was already mated, and their correspondence had just been a pleasant distraction. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word she had ever written to him, trying to pinpoint the moment she had ruined everything. In the depths of despair, she would pull out his letters and read them over and over, until the words blurred together, and she couldn't tell if she was crying from love or from grief. The second week was torture. Every footstep in the hall made her jump. Every call for the mail was a fresh wave of hope, followed by the crushing weight of disappointment. She began to lose weight, pushing food around her plate during meals without really tasting it. The work that had once grounded her now felt meaningless. The laundry was endless. The mending was pointless. And her hands moved through the motions mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The world began to lose its color again. The grays seeped back in, dulling the vibrant hues his letters had painted. She was a fool, a naive, foolish Omega who had dared to dream of love with a man she'd never met. She had built a castle of hope from paper and ink, and now it was collapsing around her. The pain of it was worse than the old loneliness. The old loneliness had been a dull, constant ache. This was a sharp, gaping wound. She stopped folding flowers. Her hands felt clumsy and useless. What was the point of creating beauty when her own heart felt so desolate? One night, when she tried to fold a flower, her hands shook so badly she tore the page. The delicate blue paper, which was meant to become a simple forget-me-not, ripped straight down the middle. She sat staring at the ruined paper, watching her tears fall onto the strips, and she felt something inside her break. The worst part was not the pain itself, but the way it made her question everything. Had she imagined his tenderness? Had she mistaken simple politeness for genuine care? She began to reread his letters with a critical eye, searching for signs that she had misinterpreted his intentions. But every word still felt true. Every sentence still carried the weight of honesty. Perhaps that was what made it worse. The letters hadn't changed. What had changed was her understanding of what they meant. She packed the rest of his letters into a small wooden box and pushed it far under her cot, unable to bear the sight of his familiar, beloved handwriting. But that night, when she lay in the darkness, she found herself pulling the box back out. She read each letter one more time, as if she could find some clue in the spaces between words, some explanation for his sudden silence. She read about his fear of thunder, his loneliness in his tower room, the way he described sunsets with the poetry of a man who had spent years alone with his thoughts. By the time she finished, she was sobbing. Not tears of despair, but tears of grief for a love that had existed, briefly, only in letters. She had given him pieces of her soul, and he had promised with his words that those pieces mattered. The silence from Wolf 123 was the loudest, most heartbreaking sound she had ever heard. It was a sound that said, "You were never enough. You were never worth the risk." It was a sound that echoed through every moment of her days. Stellan held her letter in his hand, the paper so crumpled from his repeated readings that the ink was beginning to smudge. "I love you." 3 words, 3 simple words that had detonated in his life with the force of a thunderclap. His wolf howled with triumphant joy. "She loves us. Mate claims us." The beast surged against his ribs, demanding he go to her, that he cross the entire kingdom and claim the Omega who held his heart in her hands. He pressed the delicate white paper rose to his lips, inhaling her scent. Love, hope, devotion. It was all there. But the elation was immediately followed by a cold, sickening wave of panic. Her confession had come at the worst possible moment. For months, his council, led by the shrewd and ambitious Lord Valerius, had been pressuring him to form a political alliance with the volatile Southern Pax. The proposed solution was a marriage to Lady Seraphina, the beautiful and powerful alpha daughter of the Southern Alpha, whose territory bordered their own. Valerius had argued, quite reasonably from a political perspective, that the union would secure their borders and quell the growing unrest in the borderlands, where raiders from unclaimed territories were becoming increasingly bold. He had painted pictures of the war that could come, the innocent lives that could be lost, and laid it all at Stellan's feet with the weight of a crown. Stellan had stalled for months, using every excuse he could think of, but his time had run out. The elder had cornered him in the war room, with a group of other council members present, making his position impossible to refuse without appearing weak in front of his advisors. Valerius had been smooth, almost sympathetic. "The Winter Grand Ball is in 2 weeks, Your Majesty," the elder had said, his voice smooth as oil and twice as slippery. "It is the perfect time. You will announce your betrothal to Lady Seraphina. The invitations are already being sent. The Southern Alpha has already agreed. All that remains is your public blessing." It was a trap, and he had walked right into it. To refuse now would be a direct insult to the Southern Pax, an act of political suicide that could plunge them into war. But to agree? To agree would be to betray Iris, to betray the one pure thing in his life. It would be to betray his own soul. This was the reason for his silence. He couldn't write to her. He couldn't explain the impossible choice he faced. Any letter could be intercepted by Valerius's spies, and if they discovered his connection to a low-born Omega, they would use it against him. And worse, they could harm her. The thought of anyone hurting Iris sent a murderous rage through him. The 2 weeks were a private hell. He barely slept, his mind racing in circles that led nowhere, his wolf pacing restlessly inside him, demanding answers he didn't have. Every night he would look at her white paper rose, sitting on his desk, and his resolve would strengthen. But every morning, Valerius would find him with new threats, new scenarios of disaster. He argued with his council until he was hoarse, his voice raw from shouting, his alpha power crashing against their stubborn political machinations like waves against stone. The elder was relentless, clever in the way that only centuries of political maneuvering could make someone clever. He would arrive in Stellan's study with reports and recommendations, laying out scenarios with surgical precision. "The border raids have increased 17%, Your Majesty. The Southern Pax are watching to see how strong we are. A marriage alliance would send a message. Our borders are secure because we have the South's support. Without it, they see weakness, vulnerability." Stellan would counter every argument, but Valerius always had another one ready, another angle, another pressure point. The elder saw her as a nobody, a weakness, an unacceptable choice for a king. They could not understand that her quiet strength was greater than any alpha's posturing, that her gentle heart was the only thing that could ever rule his. When Valerius would stand before him with reports of troop movements on the border, painting scenarios of bloodshed and loss, and every time Stellan would think of Iris's hands, work-roughened and gentle, folding paper flowers in candlelight, he would imagine her in his tower, writing to him by candlelight, and it would steady him. When his council spoke of duty and legacy, he would remember her letter. "I don't know if this is foolish, but I cannot keep it in my heart any longer. I love you." That was his duty. That was his legacy. Not kingdoms or treaties or power, but love. Raw, honest, all-consuming love. And he would choose her. He had to. He looked at the white paper rose sitting on his desk. It was so fragile, yet it had survived its journey across the kingdom, through winter weather and the handling of multiple couriers. It was a symbol of her resilience, her hope. It was a symbol of everything he was fighting for. On the last day, with the ball only a few nights away, he made his choice. He would not sacrifice his mate for a crown or a treaty. He would have both. He would show them all that the heart of a king was not a political tool, but a living, breathing thing capable of overriding logic with love. He would not choose between his duty and his love. His love for her was his duty. He summoned his most trusted courier, a beta from his personal guard named Marcus, who had carried sensitive messages before. He gave him the formal invitations for the Stone Creek pack, and tucked inside each one a small, anonymous card. He wrote only 5 words on it, 5 words that were both a plea and a promise. "Please come. I need to see you." He did not sign it. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that she would know it was from him. The arrival of the royal courier sent a ripple of excitement through the Stone Creek pack house. An invitation to the winter grand ball at the palace was a rare honor. Alpha Alaric puffed out his chest while his mate, Luna Alara, immediately began planning their attire. Iris watched from the corner of the kitchen, her heart a leaden weight. The capital. That was where he lived. For a wild, foolish moment, she imagined him being there, a soldier on guard duty, and her catching a glimpse of him across a crowded courtyard. The thought was so painful she had to press a hand to her chest. Then, the Pack Beta called her name. Iris Pemberton? His voice was laced with disbelief. He held out a small, thick card separate from the main invitation. The card was clearly high quality, made of expensive parchment, the kind that Stellan would have in his tower room. Her hands began to shake even before she touched it. The Beta raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. Why would an unknown soldier send a separate invitation to an Omega servant? But he offered it to her anyway. Iris took it with trembling fingers. The card was plain, her name written in the same strong, familiar script as her letters. She would recognize that handwriting in the darkness, in her sleep, in dreams. Her breath caught in her throat, the air suddenly hard to draw. She opened it with fumbling fingers, her vision suddenly blurry. Please come. I need to see you. The words swam before her eyes. I need to see you. Not, I would like to see you. Not, you may attend. I need. As if her presence was essential, crucial, necessary to his very survival. No signature. None was needed. It was him. It was Wolf 123. The world tilted, colors rushing back in a dizzying flood. All the gray that had settled into her bones over the past 2 weeks suddenly shattered like ice. He didn't hate her. He wanted to see her. He needed to see her. Hope, fierce and terrifying, surged through her with such force that she nearly stumbled. It was followed immediately by panic. Because if this was real, if he truly wanted her, then she had to be worthy of him. She had to prove that the love she had professed wasn't foolish. She had to look like a Luna, act like a Luna, even though she had no idea what a Luna should be. The ball. She was an Omega. She had nothing to wear, nothing but her drab work tunics and the single green dress that Luna Alara had given her years ago for a pack celebration. The whispers started almost immediately. An Omega? Invited to the royal ball? It must be a mistake. What could the king possibly want with her? A particularly cruel she-wolf named Lyra sneered at her in the hall, her voice dripping with malice. Planning on scrubbing the palace floors, Pemberton? At least you'll be doing what you were born for. Iris flinched, but held her head high, the small card clutched in her hand like a shield and a lifeline all at once. That evening, as Iris sat on her cot wondering how she could possibly go, how she could walk into a place filled with powerful alphas and their beautiful mates when she was just a gray, forgotten Omega, Luna Alara entered her small room. The alpha's mate was a kind woman who had always had a soft spot for the quiet Omega. She held up a dress of deep forest green, the fabric simple but elegant, the color like the heart of the forest itself. I wore this a few years ago, she said softly, her eyes warm with understanding. It is modest, but it will be warm. The color will suit you better than it ever suited me. It's the color of growing things, of hope returning to the woods in spring. And Iris? She waited until Iris met her eyes. You are worthy of being there. Never doubt that. Tears pricked Iris's eyes. Luna, I can't. Nonsense, Alara said firmly, her alpha nature lending weight to her words. Every wolf deserves to attend a ball once in their life. Go, and hold your head high. You are a daughter of the Stone Creek Pack. The journey to the capital was a blur of endless roads and towering landscapes. The closer they got to the city, the more Iris felt her courage wavering. The towering spires of the royal castle seemed to pierce the clouds, more grand and intimidating than anything she had ever imagined. More imposing than anything her small-town mind could have conjured. The castle walls were so high that she had to crane her neck back to see the top. The stone was a pale gray that caught the evening light and seemed to glow with its own power. Soldiers in pristine uniforms guarded every entrance, their bearing rigid and formal. She felt like a field mouse in a lion's den, or perhaps something even smaller, perhaps just a grain of sand being brought into a palace of gems. Luna Ilara noticed her trembling and squeezed her hand. "You are more prepared for this than you believe," the Luna had said gently as their carriage approached. When they entered the ballroom, the sheer scale of it stole her breath completely. The space was so enormous that it seemed impossible for one building to contain it. 1,000 candles glittered in crystal chandeliers that hung like captured stars from the ceiling. The golden light they cast was warm and almost seductive, transforming the room into something otherworldly. Every surface seemed to sparkle. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine. The fabric of the gowns shimmered with embedded jewels. The very air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. Alphas in their dress uniforms stood in clusters, their power a visible aura around them, making the air feel thick and charged. Ladies in breathtaking gowns laughed and danced, their confidence an almost tangible force in the air. The musicians played something lively, and couples spun across the floor with practiced grace. The abundance of it all, the gold, the jewels, the beauty, the power, was suffocating to someone who had spent her entire life in muted grays. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, and she could see herself reflected in them, a small figure in a simple green dress, looking completely out of place among the glittering nobility. Iris, in her simple green dress, felt her invisibility cloak her once more. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate beat. She clutched the small beaded purse Luna Ilara had lent her and began her search. She was looking for a man who would stand apart from the crowd, a soldier with kind eyes and a shy smile, a man who felt as out of place as she did. She searched for an hour, her initial hope slowly curdling into a familiar, bitter disappointment. She checked the edges of the room, the shadowed alcoves, the balconies overlooking the gardens. She looked near the guard station, searching the faces of warriors in uniform. She lingered by the refreshment tables, wondering if perhaps he would come to get something to drink. She even ventured near the musicians, thinking perhaps he might be watching the dancers. But nowhere, in all the glittering crowd, did she find a soldier who felt like him. He wasn't there. It had been a mistake, or worse, a cruel joke. Stellan stood on the dais, his throne a cold, hard seat at his back. He wore the formal black and silver tunic of the Alpha King, the weight of his station heavy on his shoulders. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, and his piercing amber eyes seemed to take in everything at once. Lord Valerius was a murmur at his ear, pointing out dignitaries, reminding him of his duty. "Lady Seraphina is radiant tonight, Your Majesty, a perfect queen." The words were meant to be complimentary, but they felt like chains. Stellan barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the grand entrance, his senses stretched, trying to catch a scent, a glimpse, anything. His wolf was a coiled spring of anticipation inside him. She is here. Mate is close. His wolf knew before his eyes did. Every instinct was screaming that she had arrived. He had to force himself to remain calm, to nod and smile at the endless stream of nobles who came to pay their respects. Every part of him wanted to roar, to clear the room, to go to her. He had to wait for the right moment. The plan was a wild gamble, a public declaration that would leave no room for his council to maneuver. It was dangerous, but it was the only way to protect her from Valerius's machinations. Then he saw her. She was standing near a marble column, almost hidden in the shadows at the edge of the ballroom. Her green dress was simple, her hair was unadorned, and she was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. She looked lost, small, and overwhelmed. He watched as her eyes, wide with a hope that was achingly familiar to him, scanned the crowd. He saw her searching the fringes, looking for the humble soldier she had created in her mind. He watched as she checked the guard station, hope flickering across her face with each soldier she examined. He watched as that hope began to flicker and die, replaced by the deep, wounding pain of disappointment. He saw her shoulders slump, saw her turn slightly, as if to leave. He could not bear it. He could not let her believe, even for one more second, that she was unwanted, that he had abandoned her. It was time. He took a deep breath, his fingers touching the small object pinned to his chest, hidden until now by the fold of his formal sash. He straightened and stepped forward. Iris was about to give up. The tears she had been fighting were starting to win, blurring the glittering scene into a painful kaleidoscope of light. It was all a lie. A game. A cruel fantasy. Her heart felt like it was cracking into 1,000 tiny pieces. She allowed her gaze one last sweep of the room, a final, despairing glance that drifted, without conscious thought, to the center of all the power, the royal throne. King Stellan Thorne was standing there. He was even more formidable in person than the official portrait suggested. Tall and powerful, with dark hair that caught the light like obsidian, and eyes so intense they seemed to see everything and everyone. He was the epitome of an Alpha King, a creature of myth and legend, a being from another universe entirely. His raw power was visible in the set of his shoulders, in the way the nobles instinctively gave him space. As she watched, he moved, and the light from the chandeliers caught something on his chest. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't a jewel. It was small and yellow and made of paper. Her breath hitched. Her entire world froze. Pinned to the immaculate silver and black tunic of the most powerful wolf in the kingdom was the crumpled paper daffodil she had sent him months ago. The one for hope. It couldn't be. Her mind screamed in denial, but her heart, her foolish, stubborn heart, knew. It knew his soul. Every piece clicked into place in slow motion. The elegant script of his letters, the way he described sunsets, the vulnerability he had shown her, the fact that he had somehow felt like home from the very first word. It was him. The Alpha King was her Wolf 1, 2, 3. From the dais, Stellan watched the exact moment recognition dawned on her face. Her shock was a physical thing, a jolt that seemed to run through her. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes grew wide, glistening with tears. That was his cue. He took a single, deliberate step down from the dais. The music faltered. A hush began to spread through the ballroom as hundreds of conversations died out mid-sentence. Nobles fell silent, their attention snapping like a whip to the scene unfolding before them. Lord Valerius grabbed his arm, hissing with fury. "Your Majesty, what are you doing? Lady Seraphina is waiting. The treaty!" Stellan shook him off without a glance. He had no patience for politics, for treachery, for anything that stood between him and his mate. He had eyes for only one person. He descended the remaining steps and began to walk. He did not hurry. Every step was measured, filled with a year's worth of longing, a king's absolute purpose. His alpha presence rolled across the room in waves, powerful and undeniable. The crowd of nobles, of alphas and their mates, parted before him as if by magic, their stunned faces turning from him to the small, unknown Omega in the simple green dress. Iris was frozen in place, her feet rooted to the marble floor. The entire world had narrowed to the space between them, to the sound of his boots clicking on the stone, a steady, rhythmic beat like a drum counting down the final seconds of her old life. The echo of each step seemed to resound through her chest, through her very bones. He stopped directly in front of her. He was so tall she had to crane her neck to look up at him. His eyes, a deep, piercing shade of amber, were filled with an emotion so raw and vulnerable it made her ache. He smelled of pine and winter air, a scent that felt like coming home, like every letter she had ever received made tangible. The entire kingdom was watching, but he spoke as if they were the only two people in existence. His voice was a low, intimate rumble, the voice she had tried to imagine for a year, and it was more beautiful than she had ever dreamed. "Dear Iris," he whispered, his eyes never leaving hers, "it's me." The 3 words hung in the silent air, an impossible truth that settled over her like a warm cloak. It's me, Wolf 123, her shy soldier, her lonely poet, her kind, broken-hearted king. All of it had been him, the powerful alpha, the man on the throne, the vulnerable soul who had confessed his fear of storms and his loneliness in beautiful prose. She felt something shift inside her at the revelation. Not an awakening of a dormant wolf, but the moment when she realized she had always known his soul. It was the one part of him that needed no introduction, no fangs, no fur. His soul had been bare to her from the beginning. Tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful. She saw the nervousness behind his regal facade, the vulnerability in the eyes of the most powerful man in the world as he waited for her reaction. In that moment, he wasn't a king, and she wasn't an Omega. They were just a man and a woman who had found each other through the darkness. Her hand lifted, trembling. She didn't bow or curtsy. She didn't cower as an Omega should before her Alpha King. She acted from pure instinct, from the heart that had known him long before her eyes had. She reached up, her small, work-roughened fingers gently, reverently, straightening the yellow paper daffodil on his chest. The entire ballroom held its breath. The gesture was shockingly intimate, a claim made in front of hundreds of witnesses. Her voice was a broken whisper, thick with unshed tears. "You kept it." That simple, heartfelt observation shattered his composure. A year of royal restraint, of guarded emotions and lonely nights, crumbled to dust. The king disappeared, and only the man remained. His own eyes glistened with moisture, his throat tight with a year's worth of unspoken love. His voice was raw, laced with the depth of his feelings. "I kept everything," he said, and in those 3 words she heard it all. The letters, the flowers, the shared secrets, the hope. He had treasured every piece of her she had sent him. He gently took her hand, his large, warm palm enclosing hers. He turned, not breaking his contact with her, to face the stunned, silent assembly. He drew himself up to his full height, his alpha presence flooding the room, a palpable wave of power and authority. His voice rang out, clear and absolute, leaving no room for argument or dissent. "Behold your Luna." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Lord Valerius's face went white with fury and disbelief. Lady Seraphina looked as though she had been struck, her perfect composure crumbling in an instant. Chaos began to bubble, whispers turning into angry murmurs. But Stellan ignored it all. His world had contracted to the small, brave woman standing beside him. She was no longer just an Omega. She was his mate. She was the woman who had saved him with paper flowers and honest words. She was the Luna of his kingdom, and he would die before allowing anything or anyone to take her from him. He tightened his grip on her hand, a protective, possessive gesture. He would not let them frighten her. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, his voice meant only for her. "Run with me," he murmured, a promise of freedom, of a life beyond this gilded cage. Before anyone could react, he led her away from the center of the room, away from the prying eyes and the brewing political storm. He led her toward a side door that opened onto a moonlit balcony, toward the beginning of their real story. The Omega and the king, their hands clasped together, stepping out of the suffocating ballroom and into the cool, clean air of their future. Months later, the dust had settled. The court that had raged against their union eventually came to accept the truth of their bond. Lord Valerius had been removed from the council, his schemes exposed and his influence diminished. Lady Seraphina had returned to the south, with her pride wounded but her safety intact. Alpha Alaric and Luna Alara had become treasured allies and friends, the bridge between the royal court and the provincial pax. Iris had won the hearts of the skeptics not through power or political maneuvering, but through the same quiet grace that had captured a king's heart through letters. She remembered the names of servants. She listened to the petitioners with genuine compassion. She had been present when a noble's child fell ill, and she had brought paper flowers to the sick room to brighten the darkness. When a warrior's mate miscarried, Iris had sat with her through the night, not speaking, just present. When Abeda's father was dying, Iris had made sure he was comfortable, brought him water, held his hand. These small acts of kindness rippled through the court like water breaking ice in spring. Her gentle strength was not the strength of claws or dominance, but the strength of a heart that cared. The quiet confidence she carried came not from gaining something she had lost, but from the realization that she had never needed a wolf to be powerful. She had always been powerful. She had always been worthy. She was Iris, the woman who folded paper flowers, who wrote letters that could undo a king, who spoke in the language of kindness and compassion. That was enough. That had always been enough. The transformation in her had been gradual and beautiful. She had moved from servants' quarters into the royal chambers, but more importantly, she had moved from a life of gray numbness into a life of vibrant color. Not because Stellan had given it to her, that would miss the point entirely. Iris had given it to herself. She had chosen to see beauty in every interaction, kindness in every gesture, and possibility in every moment. She had built her queenship not on the foundation of his power, but on the bedrock of her own humanity. The nobles who had once dismissed her as a mistake came to seek her counsel, not because she demanded authority, but because her wisdom was genuine. She understood loss, loneliness, the terrible ache of feeling invisible. And from that understanding, she offered comfort that no amount of power could purchase. When the council began planning policies, they would ask her thoughts. When warriors returned from the borders broken and damaged, she sat with them. When young Omegas arrived at court for the first time, frightened and uncertain, she would find them and tell them their stories mattered. Months after the ball, on a cool evening when the sun was beginning its descent, Iris sat at the window of Stellan's study, the exact window where he had written his first letter to her all those months ago, where he had watched sunsets alone and poured his lonely heart onto parchment. The very sunset he had described to her in such vivid detail was now painting the sky in strokes of gold and rose. But now she was not watching alone. Instead, she was writing. A piece of parchment lay before her, and her pen moved across the page with familiar grace. She was writing a letter to a new match in the Bonds Across Borders program, a young Omega in a distant pack who had sent a shy application in much the same way Iris once had. The girl's name was Elena, and her letter had arrived with a crack in her voice that Iris recognized. The crack of loneliness. The small, trembling hope that somewhere there might be someone who understood. Iris was writing back, telling her that the quietest voice in the room can sometimes say the most important things. She was paying it forward, becoming for Elena what Wolf 123 had been for her. A beacon in the darkness. A proof that love found you even when you had stopped looking for it. Stellan entered the study, still in his formal tunic from a council meeting, the weight of his station visible in the slight tension of his shoulders. He paused in the doorway, watching her write, the candlelight catching the shine of her hair. Her small, work-roughened hands moved across the parchment with purpose. On her desk, beside the ink and quills, there was a small vase containing paper flowers that she had folded. Fresh ones, white and blue and yellow. The colors of her heart laid bare in paper and crease. He crossed the room silently and read over her shoulder, careful not to startle her. His eyes softened as he read her words, the gentle wisdom she was sharing with a stranger. This was his Luna. This was his mate. A woman who had been told she was worthless, who had been rendered invisible by circumstance and status, and who had chosen to use her voice to lift others out of the darkness. He was so proud of her that it ached. "What are you telling them?" he asked softly, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. She didn't startle. She had come to know his presence the way she knew her own heartbeat. She smiled, leaning back against him. "That the quietest voice in the room can sometimes say the most important things," she replied. "That a letter from a stranger can change your life. That love finds the people who need it most." He reached into his formal tunic and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, his own letter. He had been writing one to her, even though they shared the same bed, even though he saw her every day. Old habits. It had become their love language, this exchange of words through paper and ink. It was a way of speaking what couldn't always be said face to face, a way of honoring the journey that had brought them together. She took it, pressing it to her heart, her eyes suddenly wet with tears. "Dear Iris?" she asked, knowing the answer as surely as she knew her own name. "Always," he said. And he sat beside her at the window, the very window where he had once watched sunsets alone, carrying the weight of a kingdom and the loneliness of a king. Now that window held two people, two hearts, watching the same sunset that had inspired his very first letter to her. The sun bled across the sky in shades of amber and rose, painting the clouds with colors that had no names, colors that could only be felt. The same colors he had described in his letters now surrounded them in reality. He took her hand, their fingers intertwining the way they always did, perfectly fitted to one another. And in this moment, in the sanctuary of ink and paper, with the smell of lavender soap and old books hanging in the air between them, the most powerful wolf in the kingdom sat with the Omega who had saved him, writing love letters to each other in the fading light. A year ago, she had mailed a piece of her own insignificance into the world, a folded piece of paper from a girl who believed she was nothing. What she got back was a kingdom's heart, written in the handwriting of a king who signed his name Wolf 123. And every evening, in their sanctuary of ink and paper, in the room that held all their secrets and all their hopes, the most powerful wolf in the kingdom would sit by a window and write love letters to the woman sleeping next to him, because some things were too sacred to stop. The paper flowers they had exchanged were more powerful than any alpha's claws. Her voice was louder than any wolf's howl. Some nights, when Stellan was particularly overwhelmed by the demands of his crown, he would come to their study and find Iris already at the window with parchment and ink waiting. She always seemed to know when he needed to pour out his heart, when the loneliness of leadership was threatening to crush him. She would sit in comfortable silence while he wrote, her presence a balm against the isolation. And when he finished, she would read his words and reply immediately, her letters grounding him in what was real and true and lasting. His council could not understand this devotion. How could a Luna spend so much time writing letters when there was a kingdom to manage? But Stellan knew the truth. This was how they managed. This was how they survived. In a world of political machinations and endless demands, they had created a sanctuary where words mattered more than status, where vulnerability was celebrated rather than exploited. The letters became a chronicle of their love, a record of a king learning to be a man and an Omega discovering that she had always been a queen. And their love, written one letter at a time, would echo through the kingdom for generations to come, a quiet, unshakable proof that the most transformative power in the world isn't found in fangs or fur or crowns, but in the moment when one soul truly sees another and decides to stay. Because in the end, that was what love was. It wasn't grand gestures or moments of passion. It was the choice, made again and again, in letters and glances and the simple act of being present. It was Wolf 123 and Iris, an alpha and an omega, a king and a woman with work-roughened hands, deciding that nothing, not duty, not power, not the entire kingdom, was more important than the truth they had discovered together. And somewhere in a distant pack, a young omega named Elena would receive a letter from her queen, and she would press it to her heart and believe, for the first time, that love was possible. And the cycle would continue, because that was the real magic. Not wolves and fangs and transformation, just people reaching out through the darkness with words and paper flowers, saying, I see you. You matter. You are worthy.